Hello students, this is Professor McDermott with the video recap of your Module 1 discussions on the topic of manifest destiny. We'll start with Group 1, who had a reading from Frank Meyer, and this reading was entitled Killing the Golden Goose. Frank Meyer was an interesting character. He was involved in the destruction of the buffalo on the Great Plains during the 1870s, and many years later, when he was about 90 years old, he wrote down his recollections of the destruction of the buffalo and how it happened. And Jack, I appreciated your pointing out the meaning of this phrase, killing the golden goose. You said, killing the golden goose is an idiom from Aesop's fable about the goose that lays the golden egg. It has to do with greed. In the story, the couple that owns the goose kills it, thinking that it must have a huge lump of gold inside it. After they kill it, they discover that it is no different from any other goose. Thus, their greed left them nothing. And Mayer's obviously making a connection between that fable of Aesop and the destruction of the buffalo. So I asked Group 1, what does Mayer mean when he says, we killed the golden goose? And your group answer, I thought, was excellent, posted by Blake Applewhite as chair. Good job as chair, Blake. The golden goose that he was referring to was the wild buffalo. The buffalo was their largest source of income and the so-called golden goose of income. They killed them at such a high rate that they were not able to reproduce fast enough to keep up with the killing. They very quickly, over a span of several years, lost their source of income due to mass murdering them and being very wasteful by killing the buffalo and leaving them for the wolves and coyotes to eat. If they would have been more selective and only killed a few at a time, they would have had a successful business for years to come. So Mayer really regrets the way that the slaughter of the buffalo happened, and he talks about how wasteful the buffalo hunters were, especially early on in the great buffalo hunt of the 1870s. And so I asked Group 1 for their second question, why does Mayer say that the hunters were wasteful? And Zyce Carswell, you summed this up very nicely. You said, instead of their using the animals for all the resources they could, they left them to die, didn't use them for all they could, and in the beginning, the buffalo to hide ratio was just proof of wastefulness. And William Dowdell, your response to question 2 really elaborates on that very nicely. You said, the hunters were wasteful in the beginning because for every 1 hide that was shipped, approximately 4 buffalo were killed. Cows, that is female buffalo, were killed more often because the hides were thinner, fur was softer, and they were in more demand. Killing the cows did not leave the buffalo with the ability to reproduce. Males were killed and often just left there to rot. So in the early 2 years of the hunt, the first couple of years of the Great Buffalo Hunt, the cows, the female buffalo, were in higher demand because their fur was softer, it was easier to work with. And so the cows were killed and the male buffalo were slaughtered simply for sport, and they were left there to rot. But the fact that the female buffalo were killed, as you pointed out very well, reduced the ability of the buffalo herd to reproduce. And so at a certain point, a tipping point occurred, and the buffalo population simply began to implode. And for the third question, I asked Group 1 whether they thought Mayer's essay was a truthful and objective account, or whether they thought it was biased. And we should always be aware as we go through the course and read these documents of possible bias, whether the author has an axe to grind, whether the author has a certain agenda. And in this case, several people objected to Mayer's use of data because he himself admits that he doesn't have completely accurate data as to the number of buffalo that were killed in a given year. However, James Herring, I liked your response to this question. You said, Although the author seems impassioned about the story, he appears to render a truthful account of events. He admits that it is not possible to have a true accounting of the number of buffalo killed in the 7-year period because of the lack of good records. This suggests that he is being objective in his research into the events. He even seeks the official records from the railroad and is told there are no records. He admits to participating in the events and makes no excuses for his own wastefulness in the handling of the hides. This adds validity to the story, and I agree with that, although I also agree with everyone who said that the data were a little bit sketchy. However, it's interesting that if Mayer was trying to simply make excuses for himself, he might have downplayed the slaughter of the buffalo, and instead he accepts full responsibility and really, pulls no punches in his condemnation of the wasteful methods of the buffalo hunters. And so I think that does add validity to his account. All right, thank you, Group 1. Moving on to Group 2, you had a document by Richard Pratt. Pratt was the headmaster of the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, one of those schools to which Indians were sent to try to assimilate them to the dominant American culture. And Pratt's famous catchphrase is, "Kill the Indian and save the man." Kill the Indian and save the man. And so I asked Group 2 what they thought that meant. And Victoria Lamberth, I thought you had an excellent response to this. You said, "When Pratt stated, 'Kill the Indian and save the man,' the first thought in my head was that he wanted the Indians to become a part of the American civilization, but he did not want any of their cultures and traditions to join them. In his mind, the Indians had to leave everything they knew just to become a part of the American culture. Pratt did not see that with the Indians coming in and bringing their culture and traditions would be a good way to create a diversity in the civilization. Having all the same culture and traditions lessens the amount of curiosity of how others go about life." And it's certainly true. Nowadays, we value diversity. We think it adds richness to culture, liveliness to national life. But in the time when Pratt was writing, people were very much under the influence of social Darwinist thought. And we'll talk more about this as we move forward in the course. But the idea was that there were certain races that were superior and that would ultimately survive in the evolutionary struggle. And there were certain races that were inferior and that would be left behind if they didn't change, if they didn't adopt the culture of the superior, the so quote-unquote superior race. And Pratt certainly believes that the Indians are on the way out, and unless they adopt white culture, they are doomed, in a sense, doomed to destruction. And so when Pratt says, "Kill the Indian, save the man," he wants to eliminate their culture so that, because he thinks that's the only way to save them as individual human beings. And that may seem strange to us, but in a way, he has a generous motive. He's trying to save their lives, even at the cost of destroying their culture. And it's interesting that Pratt really deplores the government's policy towards American Indians, and he compares it very negatively with the American government's policy towards free blacks after the Civil War. And here's what Sean K. Cleckley had to say on that subject for question 2. Pratt feels as though the merging of the blacks into American civilization was a success. They were successfully converted into the culture and were convinced that anything they knew before was not true or right before God, as they used religion to make the transition as well. However, keeping the Indians on their own reservations does not allow the Americans to come in, take over, or do as they please. The reservations allowed the Indians to remain true to their Indian nature and fight the man. It preserved their culture and civilization, while they watched the American culture from a distance. He did not want them to be on the outside looking in, but he wanted them to join the experience and participate, so that they could discredit anything else that they were taught about their history, right and wrong, heritage, and culture. And I think you summed that up very, very nicely. So Pratt says, after the Civil War, an effort was made to integrate the freed slaves, African Americans, into the mainstream American culture. and they essentially shared the same language, the same religion as other Americans. They were part of the dominant culture, but instead, with Indians, the federal government pursued a policy really of segregation, putting them on reservations, separate from the mainstream culture. And his point is that if you really want the Indians to survive and flourish, you need to integrate them, not segregate them. Integrate them into the mainstream culture, as free blacks have been integrated. Although, as we all know, that process was not was far from perfect in Pratt's day, and it's for many years afterwards. And to follow up on that, question 3, the answer given by Michael Jones, and by the way, very nice job, Michael. I appreciated your efforts to stir up discussion for these questions. Here's the answer that Michael posted. What Pratt is saying in reference to feeding the Indians to our civilization is that the people should embrace the Indians, encouraging them to come into our society and socialize with us. Other free societies were allowed in and were taught the culture, and it was successful. This strategy could also work with the Indians. The Indians would be taught to communicate and educated in certain skills before they can truly become what the country expects them to be. Pratt believed that over time, the old Indian would die, and the new Indian could be reasoned with to work with the rest of society. And that is exactly what Pratt wanted. Feeding the Indians into our civilization, integrating them into the mainstream of American culture, and that was the point of the Indian schools. Excellent job, Group 2. Moving on to Group 3, you had a very powerful document by a young woman who attended one of the Indian schools in the East, and her English name was Gertrude Bonin, but her Indian name was Zit Khalsa. And missionaries who ran the school, which Zit Khalsa eventually went to, came to her Indian reservation recruiting children, and they persuaded Zit Khalsa to go to their school. Her mother, however, didn't like that idea. And I asked Group 3, why did Zit Khalsa really want to go so badly to the school? And the group answer posted by Chair Christian Slacks is as follows, and Christian, thanks again for stepping in and doing such a nice job as chair. Zit Khalsa wanted to go to the Indian school because she was young and wanted to explore this new land that she had heard about. Children naturally want to learn new things and try new things. For example, Zit Khalsa wanted to see the apple trees and try one of the apples, since she had never done that before. Another reason Zit Khalsa wanted to travel to the Eastern land is because she had a strong desire to attend the Indian school due to the simple fact that her friend Judawin had gone. The palefaces convinced her that going east would be a much better and more beautiful option than where she currently was. Zit Khalsa was persuaded to leave home by the people of the Eastern land because she was given promises, just like we as older humans persuade children in today's time with candy. I like that. She was promised to have the ability to ride the train, which was another thing that she had never done before. So yes, she really wanted to taste those apples from the apple trees and ride that train, thinking like a child does. And Keandra Woodall, I liked your comment on the third question. I think it applies to this question as well. I believe that Zit Khalsa learned a valuable lesson. The saying, the grass isn't always greener, really can be related to her experience, and that is true, because when she got to the Indian school in the East, she found out that life was not all it was cracked up to be there, as she was told by the missionaries. And she had a number of really shocking experiences, and one of them came when the teachers of the school insisted on cutting off her long hair, and this really traumatized her. So I asked Group 2, why was she so opposed to the teachers cutting off her hair? And Tiana Redding, you had a nice response to this. Zit Khalsa was opposed to getting her hair cut because her mother taught her that, quote, only unskilled warriors who were captured had their hair shingled by the enemy, end quote. Also among their Indian tribes, short hair was worn by mourners and shingled hair by cowards. So what we have here is really a cultural misunderstanding. For Zikala-Saz, short hair had a certain meaning. It meant that you were either in mourning and deep grief and sadness, or it meant you were a coward. Either case, it had negative connotations. And the teachers at the school obviously didn't understand that, which is sad that they couldn't have made the effort to understand that. James Waters, you made a very good point here, too, where you said that tribes had distinct hairstyles which identified them from one another. Yes, each Indian tribe had its own unique hairstyle. That was part of its identity. And so when the teachers cut off her hair, that in a way was taking away Zikala-Saz's identity, her culture, her Indianness, and struck deeply at the core of her being. However, it's very interesting that when she was given the option to go back home to the reservation after graduating from the Indian school, she instead chose to stay in the East and go to a predominantly white college. And with that in mind, I asked Group 3 if they thought that Zikala-Saz's experience at the Indian school was really a totally negative experience. And Joseph Rodman, I liked your answer to this. You said mostly a negative experience. This story showed the trials and tribulations of not only her, but her people as a whole. She benefited from her English literacy, which was able to voice the pain of her people to the white society. So while the story was negative, I think she benefited afterwards by, I guess, being a civil rights activist for her culture. And that is, in fact, exactly what she was. And she wouldn't have been able to fulfill that role if she hadn't been a graduate of one of those Eastern schools. And certainly we wouldn't be reading her in the year 2017 if she hadn't gone east. So although this was a painful and difficult experience for her, ultimately you can say that it did bear fruit for her and for her people and for us. All right, everybody, a good start, a good start. And I look forward to seeing how these discussions develop in the future, especially the focus thread discussions as we go forward. Thanks very much, and look forward to future discussions.